So we have to finish up here by talking about some more adaptations that birds have. So remind me, number of chambers in the heart. Fish. 2. Amphibians.
3. 2.5. 3.5.
Reptiles.
3.5.
3.5. Birds. 4. So birds are the first group of vertebrates to have a 4-chambered heart. And a 4-chambered heart is more efficient at picking up and delivering oxygen to all the parts of the body. So the difference between a 4-chambered heart and a 3 or 2-chambered heart is that there is no mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So in thinking about the circulatory system, what is the function of our blood? What's its purpose? Ella? To deliver oxygen to every cell in our body must have a basically constant supply of oxygen in order to stay alive. And so our blood delivers that oxygen all throughout our body. How does it get oxygen then? It's delivering and giving oxygen to cells throughout our body. How does it get oxygen? Through our respiratory systems. We inhale, breathe air in, oxygen from the air diffuses into our blood, and that oxygenates it. Well, if you have oxygenated, deoxygenated blood mixing together, that's not very efficient to delivering oxygen, because some of that blood that reaches, say, our brain cells, some of those blood cells will have oxygen, some won't. So instead, a 4-chambered heart provides a circulatory system which keeps that blood completely separate. So let's look at this diagram here. This is, okay. If we think about the chambers of the heart, the left side of the human heart is the side that pumps blood to all the various parts of our body. Okay, the left ventricle pumps blood through the aorta and then to all the different parts of the body. This is the left ventricle of the heart. And that blood, as it gets to cells throughout our body, it gives up its oxygen to those cells. Then when it returns to the heart, however, it goes to the opposite side. The blood that's coming from all the different parts of our body comes into the heart here on the right side, and then into the right ventricle. Where do you think that blood needs to go next?
Out to other parts.
Well, it gave up its oxygen already, so it's not going to do much good if it goes to your brain and your muscles.
I think you were talking rich one. Die? I don't know.
Ella? It needs to get to the lungs. So the heart's right side pumps that blood to the lungs where it can get reoxygenated. It can get rid of the carbon dioxide it picked up. And then when it comes back to the heart, where do you think it comes back?
Into the right side.
And to the left side.
Left side.
And then it can get pumped out to the body again, deliver its oxygen, comes back to the other side, back to the lungs. So we have this sort of dual circulation where deoxygenated blood gets sent to the lungs, oxygenated blood can get sent to all the parts of the body, and that happens very efficiently without the mixing of blood. Gets the maximum amount of oxygen to cells. And this is important because birds and mammals require a lot of oxygen. Why do you think they require a lot of oxygen?
Use more energy.
Yes, because they use more energy. Because why do they use more energy? They're warm-blooded, so that requires more oxygen.
Roughly how long would it take for like one red blood cell to make a full trip?
I would say a minute or so.
Oh wow! I thought you were gonna say day.
No.
I think
I'm just kind of
that thing's
guessing. I don't know
moving.
the actual
The
number.
thing is wheeling. He gets in the water. He's like, come on, I gotta flight.
So eggs. We just talked about at the beginning of class the function of eggs. So bird eggs also have a waterproof shell. They keep a watery environment inside. for the embryo to grow and develop. The shell of bird eggs is hard. Okay, it's brittle, unlike reptile shells. And the shell of the egg is also permeable to oxygen and carbon dioxide. So gases that the embryo needs to develop inside of the egg can diffuse in, and waste gases can diffuse out. Depending on their environment, their ecosystem that they spend their time in, some birds migrate. For example, in our area, many birds will fly to another part of the world. From here, it would be south, but it can be lots of different directions. Why do many birds do this?
Cold. To find a warm climate.
Well, it's not so much about warm, because they can survive cold temperatures, right? They're warm-blooded. Yeah, mostly it's about food. So if you're a bird in our area that eats mostly insects, you're going to have kind of a hard time throughout our winter finding insects. Now, if you're a bird that eats sort of berries and things from trees, you might be better. You might be able to survive throughout the winter, finding enough food. So it kind of depends on the food that the bird eats and what its main sources of nutrition are. But many birds will go into another ecosystem where there's more plentiful food and then return back to their original environment once food becomes more available and so on. Now, how do birds know when to migrate, where to migrate? Well, it's pretty complicated. Many animals that have seasonal behavioral changes, they're not necessarily changing their behavior based on temperature, because that's sort of unreliable. You can have cold days in the late spring or early summer. You could have warm days in the middle of winter. So if animals relied sort of on temperature, well then they may migrate at the wrong time. They may change their behavior at the wrong time. So what other cues might they use that tells them when the appropriate time to migrate is? Cassia?
The day.
Yeah, what about it?
Like when the sun rises.
Yeah, the length of day.
That's what I was confused.
Photo period. So, because that's reliable, that's not going to change. Regardless of the weather, the length of day is consistent throughout the year. And so many species have evolved that as the days get shorter in the winter, that's their cue to migrate. How they find the place to migrate to and how to return home is also kind of questioned. Scientists thought that maybe they do it visually, or they use electromagnetic fields of the earth, or that they use the stars, other things. They're not exactly sure all of the mechanisms, probably a combination of many of those. When I was in college, I took ornithology. It's a class all about the study of birds. And they talked about some of the experiments that scientists did to try to figure out how birds navigate. Some of them were kind of not that nice. They would put opaque contacts on the bird's eyes so they couldn't see, and then release them, and they found that they were still able to navigate, even without that sense of seeing things. They strapped little magnets to their head to try to block their sense of the Earth's magnetic fields. And again, they're still able to navigate somewhat. So it's probably a combination of several factors. They can navigate using the stars, using the polarization of sunlight. Lots of different cues to kind of guide them in their migration.
Yeah, star reader.
Another factor that's important with birds is obviously the vast majority of birds are capable of flight. And that requires some certain adaptation.
Shut up.
So they need to be relatively light. It takes a lot of energy to lift a bird off the ground, so the lighter they are, the easier that's going to be. So the bones of birds are typically pretty light. If you were to pick up two bones of equal size, one from a bird, one from a mammal, they would be drastically different in their density, in their mass. Okay? bones of birds generally are mostly hollow inside, but with sort of a network of bone fiber crisscrossing between it, so that they're still strong and can support the bird's weight and muscle attachments and so forth, but they're relatively light. Whereas a mammal bone would be much more solid. So, you guys mentioned this the other day. Where did birds evolve from? Yeah, they evolved from a group of reptiles. And scientists have suspected this for a long time, and then some fossil evidence really helped them to solidify this idea. And the most famous fossil of this is a fossil called Archaeopteryx. The name means ancient bird. It was a fossil that was found in Germany that kind of shows the link between birds and reptiles. Because Archaeopteryx was an animal that had some reptile-like characteristics and some bird-like characteristics. This is the actual fossil. It had at the end of its wings, it still had claws at the end of its wings. Okay, so it didn't have, but it had feathers covering its wings. It had feathers on its tail, but it had a bony tail. Modern birds don't have bones in their tail, but reptiles do. Okay? It had scales on parts of its body, like reptiles. So that's one, this is what artists think Archaeopteryx might have looked like. There's other types of reptiles that possibly could have led to the evolution of birds, and some are covered in feathers, some would probably not fly. So the question scientists have is, well, what were the first birds that evolved? Were feathers an adaptation to flying, or did feathers evolve for some other reason, like insulation or camouflage, and then adapted from there to allow for flight? And so it's a question scientists kind of are looking at. So we talked about bird mating earlier. This is a bird of paradise is the name of it. It's got these interesting colorations. Interesting mating behavior. Oh, flexing.
Oh, damn, baby. Oh. Kill him, young fella. Oh. Oh. I love that. I don't see the video. It's visual.
I count. All right, so you get the point.
How long is this video?
I don't know.
Oh,
Yeah, I just want to see it keep going.
He's so lovely.
He's looking for a mate.
He's like,
He's trying.
I'm literally my green eyed friend. That's probably why he's probably not getting any because he's dabbing. Have you ever heard this? Have you ever seen this one? It's this green, what goes on the other side. It's like base boosted, like you're
All right. So our last topic in terms of birds is to talk about bird eggs. So we're probably pretty familiar with bird eggs, especially chicken eggs, because lots of us eat them all the time. So this is an unfertilized egg. So the eggs that you get at the grocery store are, if you were to incubate them, could they grow into a little embryo?
No.
Is there an embryo inside of that egg? No. No. They are unfertilized. How do they make sure they're unfertilized?
They put some juice in it or something.
Nope.
They wait.
Nope. Addis?
They only keep together, you know.
Yeah, they keep the rooster out of the hen house. If you ever heard that saying. So hens, female chickens, will continue to lay eggs even if they're not fertilized, even if they have not mated with the rooster. And so as long as you keep the rooster away from the hens, there's no way for them to get fertilized. And so the eggs that they gather the eggs from the hen, and they're unfertilized eggs. So if you look at an egg, if you ever look closely, this is what we're going to do tomorrow. We'll look at an unfertilized chicken egg. We could identify some of the parts, and you've probably seen these lots of times, but never really thought about what the parts are or what they do. Obviously, the outermost layer is the shell of the egg. And we'll talk about sort of what they do in a minute. Below that shell is a very thin membrane. So if you ever eat hard-boiled eggs, you're peeling them, that layer that sometimes gets stuck to the egg, yeah, you have to peel it off. That's a layer called the shell membrane, very, very thin. In an unfertilized egg, obviously the yolk is the yellow part. The egg white has a name, a scientific name. It's called albumin.
Oh, like Elvis, like the color white in Latin.
Maybe.
That's why it is.
The membrane around the yolk, like if you like to eat your eggs sunny side up, you try and, when you're cooking your eggs, not to rupture this very, very thin membrane that surrounds the yolk.
I always take that out when I eat it.
The chalazi are these little strands of protein that are attached to the yolk. At the wider end of the egg, there's a little air space. When you make a hard-boiled egg, that end of the egg has an indentation.
Yeah, and then the egg can... I didn't know that.
And then, if you look really closely on the egg yolk, you could find a very small white spot. It's called the blastoderm.
It sounds like a super villain.
This blastoderm contains the actual egg cell that, if it were fertilized, would have gone on to become the embryo. It's located there in the blastoderm. All right, so let's talk about what all these different parts do, what their purpose is. So the shell of the egg, obviously it's waterproof. It's made of calcium compounds. And actually, as it dissolves, as the embryo is growing inside, the calcium from it is used to make the skeleton of the chick that's growing inside of it.
Really?
Because as the developing embryo releases carbon dioxide gas, it mixes with water in the albumin and forms an acid called carbonic acid, and that like slowly dissolves the shell from the inside. And that dissolved calcium can be used for the skeleton. That shell membrane, that thin layer underneath the shell, that prevents bacteria from entering the egg. An egg would be really a perfect breeding ground for bacteria, so they're kept out by this membrane. It also is waterproof, so it keeps moisture in, so that the egg doesn't dehydrate. That air space that's at the wide end of the egg, that acts in two functions. It's a shock absorber, so if the egg gets jostled around, has sort of a cushion of air in there. But also when the chick is about to hatch, it pokes its beak into that air sac, and that's where it takes its very first breath, from that little bubble.
Now it's an air sac?
Air sac, air space, air cell, or something.
Let's call it one thing or the other. Come on.
The yolk, what's the purpose of a yolk?
Tastes good.
Yeah, it is nutrition. I wouldn't quite say food because the chick doesn't like eat it up and swallow it. It absorbs nutrients through blood vessels that lead from the yolk into the embryo. So the yolk is mainly fats, vitamins, minerals. That's why, like, you know, if somebody's maybe trying to eat healthier or eat less calories, they might just eat egg whites or get an egg white omelet, because in an egg, most of the fat from the egg, all the fat in the egg is stored in the yolk.
Yeah, I just thought that was so stupid. I can't imagine there's like
That membrane surrounding the yolk kind of keeps it together. And those sort of stringy proteins that are attached to the yolk, when the egg is intact, they stretch from one side of the yolk to the inside, and they sort of suspend the yolk, keep it in place in sort of the middle of the egg, so it doesn't just sink to the bottom. You could see those if you look at a cracked raw egg. There's like these white things attached to the yolk. That's what the chiles get. The albumin, the egg white, is made of protein and water. As the embryo grows, it will absorb water and absorb protein from that albumin. By the time the chick is fully grown inside of the egg, it's basically gone because it's been used up. Same holds for the yolk. As the chick embryo grows inside of the egg, it uses up those nutrients, the yolk gets smaller and smaller. And then that blastoderm, that patch on the yolk of the egg, that is where the egg cell is. If a sperm had entered that blastoderm when this egg was first produced, it would have fertilized it, and then it would have started dividing to form the embryo. If we look at the inside of the egg as the embryo is developing, there's some important changes to understand. So we have our embryo here that starts off quite small, and chicken eggs takes about 21 days for them to hatch. So in the early stages, the yolk is large, there's lots of albumin, okay, the embryo is pretty small, but as time goes on, it uses up energy from that yolk sac, it uses up protein, liquid from the albumin, and that gets smaller and smaller until by the time the chick is fully grown, basically all that's left inside of the egg is the fully developed chick, pokes its beak into the air cell, takes its first breath, and then starts to break out of the egg by pecking at that shell. It has a special part of its beak that's often used called the egg tube, which helps it to break through that egg first time.
Is the yolk sac connected to the embryo by an umbilical cord type of thing?
Yeah, it's similar. It has blood vessels. We're going to see it here. Blood vessels that bring the nutrients from the yolk right into the blood supply of the embryo. So it's similar to the umbilical cord. In fact, human embryos have a yolk during their very, very first stages of development that they use. It provides them with blood cells until organs start to develop. So if we look at a fertilized egg, we have the embryo, which is the developing bird, the yolk, the albumin, as we already labeled, and then surrounding the embryo is a small membrane called the amnion, and it's filled with fluid that sort of helps also to cushion that embryo as it's growing. And also attached to the blood vessels of the chick is this organ called the Allantois, which helps to remove waste. It's a respiratory organ, and it stores waste. If you look closely as that embryo grows, there's some more detail. Again, there's the embryo, the amnion, there's the yolk membrane, the Allantois, and what you can see in this picture are these vessels that take the nutrients into the chick's body. Their Allantoic vessels are for breathing, for removing waste. The yolk vessels are for absorbing nutrients. Diksha?
Can you go back one?
One side?